I think that was not by chance that it happened when Congress was out of session.
Yeah.
Because, if we were here, if it had happened when we were in session, people would react right away. And I think they had the benefit of us being, and, frankly, people being distracted by the holidays. I will acknowledge at the top of this that, Secretary Rubio did try to reach me a couple of times. He had an old number of mine, so we didn't connect, but it was after the strike had taken place. So it was not the way we're supposed to be handling these affairs. And, as you know, Joyce, the whole rationale of how you brief classified information is we set up the system called the Gang of Eight, where, these are the most trusted members of Congress who have the most expertise. And I do get the fact if you brief 535 members before a strike, word could get out. But the Gang of Eight has never leaked. And Marco Rubio was a member of the Gang of Eight and my partner for many years when he was in the Senate on this. So some of the after-fact descriptions don't meet the reality.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's fair to say. Look, folks are filtering in. I know your time today is precious. I'm grateful you're here. Can I just dive right in without the niceties?
Absolutely.
Everybody knows who you are.
Yeah, you have no intro. I'm Mark Warner from Virginia, and great to be with you today, Joyce.
So look, I mean, you talked about the Gang of Eight and the failure of briefing. Can you talk, just how abnormal is that?
Well, the Gang of Eight was set up for exactly these circumstances. How do you consult with Congress? And I use consult with the appropriate parentheses in it because it's normally not a robust consultation. Even under Trump 1 or Biden or Obama, it was oftentimes you'd be notified hours or even sometimes even minutes before the action took place. With this administration, no matter what the circumstance, the bombing in Iran, where Republicans were notified but Democrats weren't, again, after the fact, now this circumstance, and I think many of my Democratic colleagues, or the 3 or 4 that were part of the Gang of Eight, again, it's only 8 members, I'm not sure they ever got an outreach. I did, I've got a relationship with Secretary Rubio, so he did reach out, but it's when it's after the fact, it's like you could, technically they could just send you the press release. So that's not the purpose here. The purpose is if you've got a classified secret operation going on, you have to let the most trusted members of Congress know because they know how to respect that information. And that did not happen. Again, not shocked because under this administration, the rules of the road are ignored on a regular basis.
You've been trying to raise awareness about the politicization of intelligence for months now. I've been watching you do that. You did that during the boat strikes. That's obviously an issue here with Democrats in particular not getting briefed. And you've called that corrosive to our democracy in earlier comments. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, it's just, I so expected, and to a degree this happened under Trump 1, that, kind of the old adage that politics ends at our nation's border, that in terms of the independence of our intelligence community, I thought people would stand up and step up for that. Because the men and women of the intelligence community, they never get the attention, the attribution that our military does. And our military, in this case in Venezuela, executed amazingly. It is a remarkable story. But on the intel community, we know what happens when you cook the books on intelligence. That's how you get into wars like Iraq. And the idea is the whole role of intelligence is to speak truth to power. And we have seen since the beginning of this administration a complete undermining of that. If people are not willing to kind of cook the books, you get fired. And early on, there's these national intelligence estimates, when kind of a formal opinion. The top professionals were asked early on, the very bad guy gang, Agua, I think I'm mispronouncing a little bit, but, aren't they just an arm of Maduro? They came back, the intelligence expert, and said, bad guys, Maduro bad guy. I'm the first to acknowledge that as well. But they don't have a formal tie. And then they got fired because they wouldn't cook the books. We've seen, the head of the Defense Intelligence Agency, again, when the military did a great job on bombing Iran, but they said, Trump said, I think the word was obliterated, but they didn't say it was obliterated because it was not, that the Iranian facilities, and the general in charge of DIA got fired. So when you have this, you know, willingness to corrupt an intelligence product for political purposes, that is so undermining in terms of not just rule of law, but it really undermines as well. I hear from the military leaders, boy, oh boy, they are concerned that if they're getting bad intel because you have to be fitting to a policy goal, that doesn't make America stronger. It makes America less safe. So this is ongoing, and again, I know we've got a lot to talk about, but the case in point that I interacted in particular was this crazy right-wing blogger Laura Loomer, who was so out of the mainstream that she couldn't even get hired by the Trump administration. She brags regularly about taking down, for example, the head of the NSA, General Hawk. She was bragging about taking down the head of the Defense Intelligence Agency. She bragged about taking down some of the bad actors on the Signalgate call where they were treating intelligence, classified information cavalierly. And, she came after me because she tried to stop me from doing my intelligence oversight at one of the agencies, the National Geospatial Agency, which kind of looks at all of the data we collect from satellites. And boy, oh boy, if you can't do your oversight, there are only certain members who have that right, who are on the intelligence committee to get that access. So this is, we could spend the whole time talking about, I know we need to talk about Venezuela, but it makes this product, and I know it puts, if the product gets corrupted or if members of the intelligence community feel like they can't speak truth to power, you're going to have the best people leave. And again, it's going to make America less safe.
This is inside baseball. I mean, as you say, we could probably talk about this for hours. I think it's really important. I'm glad that you're focused on it. And I think people that are watching and listening need to understand that as they're talking with people in their communities, because I firmly believe we're all the best communicators in our neighborhood, our family, this is something to talk about, right? A fact-free intelligence community where people are afraid to report what's actually true. That makes us all less safe. It makes military strikes, for instance, far more dangerous. And, something I wanted to ask you about, you've got Norfolk in the Commonwealth of Virginia. American troops are perhaps going to be boots on the ground in Venezuela, maybe in other places. Trump mentioned 6 other countries this morning. Are you worried about that? Is that a realistic prospect?
Amen. And let me address that in 2 ways. One, I saw this firsthand. This goes back to the incident that's been called Signalgate, where Pete Hegseth was talking about, a strike that was going to take place, again, with airmen and sailors dispatched from Norfolk, from my home state of Virginia, and cavalierly talking about that before the strike took place. If that information had gotten out, the Houthis, who we were striking in Yemen, have capacity to shoot down our planes. And boy, oh boy, I ran into a lot of family. I did a town hall immediately after this. People were madder than hell, and they had a right to be. Because, if anybody else had treated this information this way, any member of the military, any a line person at CIA, they'd be fired. No questions asked.
And probably prosecuted, too.
Probably prosecuted.
Yeah.
Now let's fast forward to this fall, where we've got close to 20% of our whole fleet dispatched to the Caribbean. This is the largest armada we've put. I believe it's even larger than what was offshore Panama back in when they took out Noriega. And I've got these moms and dads of these sailors saying, Senator, what's going on? What are my kids want to protect America, but are they protecting America? Are they going to be in harm's way? There was never a case made. And let me, also make the point. This is not to defend Maduro. Maduro was an awful ruler, and I am critical as well. I'm trying to be equal opportunity critic. The Biden administration in 2024, when the Venezuelan people voted in overwhelming numbers to throw out Maduro, we didn't put near enough pressure then on other regional powers to get him to go. But that badness doesn't then give our current president the ability to individually decide, okay, I'm going to do this, not notify Congress, not tell the people what our goal is, He made it first the goal was drugs, but if it's drugs are barely mentioned on Saturday, and again, the hypocrisy of, well, if our system's the best and we've got the best evidence, well, then why take the former Honduran president? I know I get kind of deep in the weeds here, but you got a group that follows this.
You've been talking about this all week.
Who was convicted of exact similar crimes as Maduro, and then get pardoned. But you talk about lowering, any moral high ground we had. And then just one last point on this, which as I get into this meeting this afternoon, is one of the most important questions. What about the precedent set? You're a lawyer. I went to law school. I never practiced, but you know this stuff much better than I. But if you start with the underlying belief here is that because we believe Maduro broke American law, we can go in and extract him purely based on that. He's a bad guy, violation of American law. Well, what would then stop Vladimir Putin from saying, you know what, that Zelensky has broken Russian law, so America can't complain about me going in and getting Zelensky, or saying the Polish president has violated Russian law, or China, the more, obvious case, the Communist Party of China has said for 55, 60 years that Taiwan is a rogue breakaway province. Well, if you can say by violating Chinese law, they have a right then to go into Taiwan, where this leads is to a world where any big country under the guise of their existing law could go into their smaller country and take out opposition with total impunity. That is not a kind of world that we want to live in.
Yeah, that sort of might makes right argument is, I think, deeply frightening. And the precedential value of this is, again, something that we should all be talking with folks about. You said something so interesting, Senator. You talked about the size of the armada that the United States took to Venezuela. It sounds to me like you don't think that this was just an arrest of somebody that the Southern District of New York had indicted, that it sounds more like an act of war. And of course, that brings us to the Constitution and Article 1 and Congress's war powers. And I get that over time that's been diluted some, that presidents have assumed more power, that Congress has granted presidents some power. Explain to us how that works so we have an understanding of the state of play.
Well, the War Powers Act, as Congress has continued to cede power, and this is, again, not just with Trump, it's happened under the last half dozen presidents. And the War Powers Act says, even if the president acts, and oftentimes the War Powers Act was in the case of usually a response to some other kind of action. I think back years and years ago, showing my age, when the North Koreans seized a ship called the Pueblo, and America had to do something. Maybe you don't go through a full formal process of declaration of war, but you take action, and then you have to prove your case supposedly within 60 days. My dear friend and fellow Virginia Senator Tim Kaine has been probably the biggest advocate of trying to give Congress the war powers responsibility back. And he's been willing to actually even take on somebody he and I both admire greatly, President Obama, when he felt that he was going too far in some of the actions in the Middle East. So he will bring up the War Powers Act this week to say we can't, if we're going to go to military action with Venezuela, Congress has to approve. That's, remember, as you know, and all of your listeners and viewers know, the whole basis of why we set up this country is we didn't think one person, King George III back in the 1770s, ought to have absolute power. But we seem to be defaulting back to that. And if it doesn't scare the hell out of you, it should. And this is, we think about the precedence issue here. We think about the idea that this was simply a legal action. 20% of our Navy, 150 planes launched. The Delta Force, which is the most elite of our elite military, sent in to extract Maduro. And they did a great job. But could you imagine if some other country said, all right, we're going to put 20% of their Navy in the Chesapeake Bay, and they're going to launch hundreds of airplanes and helicopters and try to extract the President of the United States from the White House? And that would be viewed as a legal action. Come on. It doesn't pass a smell test.
And so given that that's the situation and that there are war powers implications, as I understand it, this will be a privileged resolution, so it will go to the floor of the Senate this week. It takes a simple majority to pass. Are you optimistic that that will have a real impact? Is this putting your marker down with the administration? How should we understand this?
So I have been, um, I'm sometimes reflexively bipartisan just
I've
because,
heard that about you.
I know it is like, and there's nothing intellectually better about bipartisan other than the fact that both teams then have to own the outcome. And, where we started our conversation, where it used to be, at least in terms of intelligence and non-politicization, that was something we all kind of hung together on. I've been so bitterly disappointed by the failure of my Republican friends. I know many of them love our country to not step up. And I kept, I've had so many private conversations. I've literally had, as I sometimes harass my friends inside the intelligence briefings, which are almost always secure. So I'm not trying to embarrass them publicly. So I'm doing this in the meeting, and they all would come up and say, "Mark, you ought to keep doing this." And we'd had one senator say repeatedly, "Oh, Mark, it's like you're our conscience." I don't want to be your damn conscience, So I kept thinking, hoping, praying, because you got to stay optimistic in this stuff. That in light of the elections in Virginia, New Jersey, New York, in light of some of the unease about the actions on the boat strikes, that my Republican friends would find their voice. And if they're not willing to find their voice now with something that is so clearly outside the norm, with something that is also, President Trump in many ways got elected because he thought it was going to take us out of foreign wars. I can't believe this is politically popular with his so-called own base. If they're not willing to show courage where something is so clear and there's no even short-term political expediency to standing with Donald Trump on this action, boy, oh boy, that I'm desperately hoping and praying that I'm proven wrong and that we can show some kind of bipartisan, all right, Mr. President, you got to come with a plan. You got to explain what our goal here is. And the fact that they've even kind of dropped the pretense that it's drugs, that it's all about Venezuelan oil. And again, Americans all recall that, remember it was supposed to be the Iraqi oil was supposed to pay for the invasion of Iraq. Now the Venezuelan oil is supposed to pay for this. The Venezuelan Maduro, again, has been so inept that the Venezuelan energy industry is so decayed that it would take any estimate I've seen 2 to 3 years before it could get back up to any kind of output capacity. They should export 4 million barrels a day. Are we going to be stuck there for 2 or 3 years? It doesn't, again, and how do you, kind of govern a country, run the country, as Trump has said, with our armada offshore? This seems so not thought through. And then layer on top of that as well, just the fact that, I think, again, both political parties have thought for the last 70 years that, we have always had kind of benign neglect towards our countries in the Western Hemisphere. And I think, I've always been, like, exchange student in Argentina. I have a great, affection for this part of the world. I think America needs to focus more. But for 70 years, we've tried to move away from saying we're not an imperial or colonial power. We're going to try to work with you as partners. Well, all of that seemed to go out the door on Saturday as well, where the presidents kept talking about areas of influence. And, that's a 1950s concept, where authoritarian big countries get this, areas where they get to have, run the show. Was that really what the American people want? And I tell you this much, it would turn Central America and South America even more against us. Again, that does not make us safer.
I know you've got to go. Let me just ask you real quick on this point about destabilizing the hemisphere. I'm sure you've seen this pinned tweet on the State Department's Twitter site as of this morning. It's a post, it's a big picture of Trump, and it says something about, he will take control of the hemisphere. Are we going to be able to keep that from happening? I saw that and I just thought it was revolting and frightening, and we need to know that Congress is on the job.
I pray that does not become, a reality. And again, trying to see it as much as possible from the other guy's shoes. Maduro, I think, was voted down in 2024. He is a bad guy, etc. But when the president now goes off and says, well, we may go after Colombia or Mexico next. We may not like the presidents of Colombia or Mexico, but they were elected by their people. Cuba, different story. But the idea that we're going to, we as supposedly defenders of democracy are going to then arbitrarily choose without support from our own people, let alone the region, we're going to, somehow have some base case that says we can go anywhere and do anything. That is, history is full of examples where that doesn't work out.
Well, look, thanks for your time. I wish I could hold on to you for a couple of hours, but we appreciate what you're doing and appreciate you being with us.
Well, I
Thank
hope we
you
get a
so
chance
much.
to do it again, because this is not going to be a one and done in terms of this story. So I hope I get a chance to visit again.
Well, come back anytime and let's talk about war powers.
Yes, ma'am.
All
Thank you so
right.
much.
See you soon. Bye-bye.